When will the Government commit with work via the Home Office to ensuring that we have a 5-year rolling programme so that farmers can make the right decisions for their staff?
You will be aware that this year we've granted an extra 15,000 visas through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme. We've also committed to those people being guaranteed a minimum of 34 hours a week paid at the national minimum wage. There's also the option of an extra 10,000 visas if the industry requires that. We'll continue to monitor and work with the industry how the scheme is working and support those farmers that require that labour.
Richard Baker.
Mr. Speaker, one of the most important roles for rural farmers is their ability to offer up land for affordable housing for rural people. What discussions has my right honourable friend had with the new Housing Minister about the more vigorous implementation of the Self-Building Custom House Building Act? And if he hasn't yet, when does he plan to do so?
My honourable friend is very astute at getting his pet topic into DEFRA questions. I pay tribute to the work he's done on self-build. Of course, we always have discussions with DLUC, whose responsibility it is, about land use, and of course we'll be producing a land use framework later this year.
Spokesman, the Shadow Minister, Daniel Zeitner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Minister sometimes characterised my line of questioning as a touch gloomy, so I'm going to try and cheer him up this morning by saying how pleased I was to hear his announcement at NFU conference that the agricultural sport £2.4 billion per annum would be ring-fenced, and if it is underspent in 1 year, it would be carried forward into future years. Now, I'm sure we're delighted that the Treasury has become such a kind, benevolent, caring organisation, but could he just repeat that promise in the House this morning and maybe get one of his officials to write to me to point to where in his department's accounts that money is so we all keep an eye on it?
Well, I'm glad we're making progress, Mr. Speaker. And, do you know, if only the Honourable Gentleman had read the Conservative Party manifesto at the last election, he would have known that and he wouldn't be as gloomy. So I would encourage him to continue to monitor the Conservative Party manifesto. Of course, I'm happy to confirm £2.4 billion, as I said to the Honourable Gentleman opposite as well, is ring-fenced for the support of farmers. And so where is it? It's being spent at the moment, as he will know. Some of it is being spent on the basic payment scheme, as that scheme comes down over 7 years, and then we're increasing the payments through ELMS as the basic payment comes down. It's a very simple graph. As one comes down, one goes up. We're supporting farmers up and down this country.
SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit barriers impacting exports, labour and skill shortages across the economy have exacerbated underlying inflation, worsening the economic outlook for farmers who are already grappling with labour shortages, rising energy and animal feed costs and the appalling spectacle of unpicked food rotting in fields. A one-size approach to labour shortages does not fit Scotland, the population of which is actually falling. So what consideration will the Minister give in Cabinet and with her Cabinet colleagues to the Scottish Rural Visa Pilot Scheme, which is desperately needed to address Scotland's specific needs?
Minister.
To the Honourable Gentleman behind her, the Government does recognise there are challenges with labour supply. That's why we've increased the number of visas to 45,000. There is the option of an extra 10,000 if that is required. The industry has not called on the extra 10,000 at this moment in time, but we remain ready to deploy those extra 10,000 visas if the industry can demonstrate they are required.
Luke Pollard.
Question 6, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The list of designated bathing waters is updated annually, as I'm sure the honourable member knows, and we will be giving the updates for the new list in May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that answer. As a keen wild swimmer in Devil's Point, Firestone Bay in Plymouth Sound, which is the country's first national marine park, I've been working with Plymouth City Council to declare that really special piece of water as a designated bathing water. So can I ask the Minister to don her wetsuit and join me in the sea, where I can show her not only this incredible piece of water, the expanding access to the water, especially for communities, for people from poor communities, and importantly, the raw sewage pipe that occasionally emits such appalling human waste into what is a very special and environmentally important bit of our sea.
I thank him for that. I do actually wear a wetsuit when I go swimming in the sea. I'm a bit of a coward, Mr. Speaker, but I do love to go swimming in the sea and put my wetsuit on. As he knows, in terms of that particular designation, he will have to wait until May to see where we go with that. But what I would say is we've got 421 designated bathing sites already in England. That was of last year. That's gradually been going up. And the good news about those is that 93% of those are classed as excellent and good. So the record is extremely good. And I'll take a rain check on whether I join in for a swim.
Mr. Virgil.
Speaker, but why are there only 421 such sites? People can go swimming, wild swimming, anywhere in England and indeed in other parts of the United Kingdom. Isn't this whole designation scheme essentially a rationing scheme? And why doesn't the government just abandon it and enable people to swim in bathing waters anywhere?
Well, to be quite honest, one can swim wherever one wants. It's just that there is a process for what we call designating bathing waters, and in terms of the application for that, one has to demonstrate that they have there is sufficient interest in using that site in terms of high numbers of people wanting to use it, that there is car parking facilities, public facilities, loos and so forth. So all of that is actually part of encouraging these designated sites, but that's not to say people in their own right could in fact choose to go wherever they wanted.
Sharon Burry.
7, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Speaker. Our Landmark Fisheries Act 2020 sets out the legal framework within which we manage fish stocks in the UK waters, including fisheries management plans for key stocks. We work with industry and stakeholders, ensuring previous fish stocks are managed to benefit our marine environment, fishing industry and coastal communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently hosted the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations in Parliament, as the Minister will know, so they could launch a report highlighting concerns within the fishing industry across the UK about the loss of fishing grounds to an array of pressures, of which offshore wind and marine protected areas top the list. What assurances can the government give that they will speak to the NFFO and ensure that fishing is an important factor?
So I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady and all that she does for the fishing sector. We do welcome the NFFO's spatial squeeze report, which highlights the need for a holistic approach to spatial planning. I meet regularly with the NFFO to discuss a wide variety of issues, including spatial prioritisation and the concerns outlined in that report.
Gillingham.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State and the Minister need to travel to Teeside to meet people from the fishing and wider community who are still looking for answers to the ongoing deaths of crustaceans, fish and other sea life off the coast. Yeah. If I set it up, will they come to Teeside and explain what they're going to do next to find out what is causing this ongoing crisis?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I share his desire to know the cause of that terrible disaster. Now, the challenge is that the science has looked at this, has done a report. They've come to the conclusion that it was probably a pathogen that is very difficult to detect. And unless there is another event, which I sincerely hope that there isn't, we may never know the cause of that event.
We come to Sir Edward Lee.
8, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is supporting Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, to export grain to countries most in need, including contributing £5 million to President Zelensky's Grain for Ukraine initiative. And the government is also focused on the long-term drivers of global food insecurity, including climate change and biodiversity loss. We are supporting international programmes to improve the sustainability and resilience of the global food systems.
Sir Edward Lee.
Form of food security is to grow more of your own food, and Lincolnshire is the breadbasket of England. So it makes no sense that there are planning proposals to cover 10,000 acres of my constituency of Gainsborough with solar panels. We're all in favour of solar panels, but there are millions of acres of flat warehouse roofs they could go on. So will the Minister change the planning guidelines so that there is a presumption against building solar panels on 3B as well as 3A land? Because in reality there is no difference in terms of growing good wheat and barley between 3A and 3B.
Well, my honourable friend will be aware that DLUC is the government department responsible for planning, but the best and most versatile land is defined as land in grades 1, 2 and 3A of the agricultural land classification, and the National Planning Policy Framework sets out that local planning authorities should consider all the benefits of the best and most versatile land when making plans and decisions on development proposals. So where significant development of agricultural land is shown to be necessary, they should seek to use poorer quality land in preference to the higher quality.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister give an update on progress with tackling avian influenza?
Of course, and we continue to work closely with AFA and government vets to monitor. We're working with the sector to make sure we have the best biosecurity available. I think there's been a fantastic response from that sector to improve their biosecurity. But of course, we continue to face the challenge of avian influenza. I think the long-term solution to the challenge is a vaccine, which is currently not available. We will give every support we can to the scientific sector to try and develop such a vaccine.
Christine Jardine.
Speaker, question number 9, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bill contains a variety of our manifesto commitments that we are committed to progressing as when parliamentary time allows, but the leader will continue to announce business in the usual way.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much. The 2021 commitment to tackle puppy smuggling via the Animal Welfare Bill was very welcome, certainly by a number of my constituents, but I'm getting a lot of them concerned now because the secondary legislation being considered under the currently frozen bill includes provisions to restrict the movement of heavily pregnant dogs, young puppies and dogs with cropped ear. Though their concern is that the levels of puppy smuggling continue to rise. So can the Minister provide assurances that the Government will continue to work towards ending this horrible practice and the movement of these poor animals across the borders? Yes, I can give her that assurance. It is our intention to deliver the manifesto commitments. We're doing that in a number of different ways. We've provided legislation to support a number of them through my private members' bills. But as I say, the Leader of the House will continue to be responsible for announcing how business of government bills progresses.
Sir Desmond Sway.
For years, we've told people we couldn't do anything about the cruelty of live export. She will understand their frustration now that it's in our gift and in this bill, won't she?
Indeed, that's why it's been in our manifesto commitment. It's why it's a freedom that we will be able to deploy having left the European Union, and I'm conscious that people are very interested in the progress of the bill, but I stand by my answer earlier.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're increasing levels of peatland restoration through our Nature for Climate Fund in order to restore approximately 35,000 hectares of peatland by 2025. And to date, we've committed £33 million to restore the 20,000 hectares of peatlands with a further bidding round in 2023.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank her for that answer. Well-maintained peatlands are a crucial nature resource in fighting the climate crisis. The Somerset Levels near Bath contain 231 square million of peatland, storing nearly 11 million tonnes of carbon, but 80% of the UK's peatlands are so degraded they are acting as a net zero source of greenhouse gas emission, but doing the opposite of what they're meant to do. The ISPB say that part of the problem is the lack of available contractors with the necessary skills and capacity to allow rapid restoration work. What is the Secretary of State doing, or the Minister doing, to increase the number of contractors?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've set out in our Peatland Action Plan the measures that we will be taking, and she is absolutely right in recognising the value that England's peatlands provide. They're our largest terrestrial carbon store, also providing homes for rare wildlife, regulating our water supply and providing a record of the past, all incredibly important. And in the Net Zero strategy, we committed to restore approximately 280,000 hectares of peatland in England by 2050.
Mr. Carmichael.
13, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, apologies. I lost my place in my. I don't think it is, mate.
I was told he'd withdrawn.
I don't know the answer, Mr. Speaker. It's not me.
Apologies, Mr. Speaker. I was actually told that gentleman had, the honourable member had withdrawn. So thank you very much for that. We've banned single-use plastic straws, cotton buds and stirrers, and recently announced that additional items will be banned from October 2023, including plates, cutlery and polystyrene food and beverage containers. And we're committed through our 25-year environment plan, our ambition to eliminate all avoidable plastic waste by 2042.
Mr. Carmichael.
The Minister has a long-standing record in this area, Mr. Speaker. I thought she might be jumping to get to the dispatch box to answer my question. We have to accept, though, that although we were making very good progress in reducing and eliminating the use of single-use plastics before COVID, the measures that were necessary during lockdown did see a lot of that reversed, and there is now a need for a renewed and reinvigorated approach to it. Unfortunately, in Scotland, we have a rather poorly designed deposit return scheme, which risks causing further damage to the cause of reducing single-use plastics. So would the Minister join me and other members across the House to design a strategy which will get the eventual elimination of single-use plastics that can enjoy everyone's support?
Thank you. Yes, as he knows, I'm always very keen to talk about these issues, but actually, frankly, I believe this government is doing a really great job in terms of setting the direction of travel for reducing our plastics and indeed pressing on with all of our schemes, not just the individual bans that I've outlined, and also the extended producer responsibility scheme, the data reporting section of that's already started, the deposit return scheme, and then our consistent collections. And I'm sorry that about what he says about the Scottish deposit return scheme, but certainly we are pressing on here with all of our commitments and our targets to eliminate all avoidable plastic waste.
Question number 14, please.
I thank her for her question, and just on a similar note that I was just talking about, the Resources and Waste Strategy sets out these plans to eliminate all avoidable plastic waste by 2042, and to do this we've introduced a whole range of bans on certain items, plastic items, as she will know. We've introduced that extended producer responsibility scheme. Data gathering's already started for that. The DRS scheme will come on board, and the consistent recycling.
Blair Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is huge support for banning plastic in wet wipes from across the House, from retailers, from producers, from water companies. The government's own consultation on this ended over a year ago now, but it was not included in the recent plastic announcements. Government action on this is so slow. Yes. Will the Minister support the Water UK water companies campaign to ban the wipe? And will the Minister meet with me to talk about when the government will finally be bringing in that banning of plastic in wet wipes?
I thank her for this, and I know how passionate she feels about this. I do too, but of course we have to get it right. We're still analysing that call for evidence, but in fact great care has to be taken in terms of even considering something flushable, even if it hasn't got plastics in it. Where does that go? Where does it end up? What's happened? So we've actually asked for extra information on that as well. Flushable is critical, and what I would do is urge people not to flush things down the loo, because that's where we get these blockages and these fatbergs. I recently went to a nursery where they were making homemade wet wipes out of kitchen roll, and none of that went down the loo. And if you want to see my video on that, go on to my Instagram.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we published an update on our environmental land management scheme for the 26th of January. We've worked to ensure that there is something for everyone, and we're expanding the sustainable farming incentive offer and launching a new round of landscape recovery this year, and we'll expand and enhance our popular countryside stewardship scheme later on.
Greg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for that answer. The £168 million Farming Investment Fund, the 6 new standards of SFI, the ELMS prospectus is good news. It is really good progress. But from the NFU conference this week and from conversations I've had with the Buckinghamshire Committee of the CLA, there is still detail missing to give farmers the long-term certainty they need. So can I urge my right honourable friend to get the full detail of these schemes on the table as soon as possible?
Yeah, well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. Of course, we will continue to publish more information on our environmental land management schemes during the course of this year. This includes further details by the summer on the new actions that will be made available through the Sustainable Farming Incentive and Countryside Stewardship.
Sherman.
Mr Speaker, I'm not usually a fan of Jeremy Clarkson, but I've been absolutely addicted to his television programme and the ventures of Diddley Squat Farm. Would you agree with me that anyone who looks at that programme gives you a real insight into the bureaucracy and the complication? This particular scheme, very complicated for farmers who want to earn a living and feed this nation. Will you go down and visit Clarkson's farm and giving him a bit of support?
Well, so I would also join him in paying tribute to Mr Clarkson and what he's doing to advertise what's happening in the agricultural sector and some of the challenges that they face. He should, of course, bear in mind that the series was filmed before we announced lots of the detail around our ELM scheme. So some of the criticisms that is levelled at the department have now been resolved, and that information is out there. But I think what he is doing is communicating to a different generation about the challenges of food production.
16, Mr Speaker.
With Mr. permission, Mr Speaker, I'd like to group questions 16 and 18. So DEFRA does lead on food supply, and we are working closely with Cabinet Office to ensure food supply is fully incorporated into emergency preparedness. The UK does have a highly resilient food supply chain and is well equipped to deal with situations with the potential to cause disruption. A high degree of food security is built on supply from diverse sources, strong domestic production and imports through stable trade routes. DEFRA has a collaborative relationship with industry which allows us to effectively respond to disruption should it occur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With the ONS highlighting a 16.8% increase in food prices in the year to January, government has built its food poverty infrastructure with dependency on voluntary donations and retail waste donations. However, due to demand, food banks in York are running out, eking out food supplies. For my part, I'm holding a citywide donation day so that those who can give and those in need receive. We call it York Together as we support one another. However, what is the government doing to ensure that no one goes without?
Well, Mr Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right to praise the initiative in York with her constituents, and I think that's very welcome. It is an element of what can also be done locally. But we talk about aspects of food pricing. Inflation is really tough at the moment. There's no doubt about that. And I'm conscious, though, that we still have a situation where, generally across Europe, we have one of the lowest proportion of our incomes being spent on food. Supermarkets have been very competitive, and we may discuss some of that later. But I do want to encourage her to also work with and supporting the Household Support Fund. That is intended to go to people particularly in need. But of course, we do know that one of the best ways to boost their incomes is not only to get into work if they're not on work already, but potentially to work some more hours, to get upskilled, to get higher income. But of course, the local welfare grant that was given some time ago now by central government to local councils is there for them to use as well.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the Secretary of State's first answer, she talks about domestic security and domestic growing. But across broadcast media this morning, it's been made clear that the UK government has refused to give support to greenhouse growers across the winter season, which has added to the shortages that we're now seeing and the restrictions in supermarkets. Why is it that this government is refusing to help those farmers and ensure that we have domestic food security and that we don't have these shortages across the supermarkets?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman, I think, raises an important point. Right now, at this time of the year, we normally do import about 90 to 95% of our food because we cannot grow in our soils. So I appreciate there are industrial greenhouses that could grow some of these materials. Now, We do know that energy prices have been going up. We know that government has been supporting businesses. It is where the change happens in coming April, where there may be, I understand, the impact on greenhouses. But that's why we'll continue to try and work with the industry. But we've always, in particular on things like tomatoes, been a significant importer, recognising that farmers will choose to use the land in the best way they think in order to have a sustainable farming business in the UK.
Scott Benton. Not here. Let's go to Topicals with Lawrence Robertson, who is here.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am aware that many members will be concerned about the reports of availability of various horticultural projects right now. As my right honourable friend, the Farming Minister, was saying earlier, DEFRA is working closely with the industry to understand the issues with that supply chain. There's been a particular issue in Spain and North Africa before Christmas and shortly after, and indeed officials are already working with food retailers, and the Minister will be meeting them, I think, very early next week, specifically to talk through certain aspects for supermarkets.
Horace Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In mid-March, the greatest National Hump Festival will take place in my constituency at Cheltenham Racecourse, a sport which only this week the Prime Minister hailed as a showcase for global Britain. But to maintain this world-leading position, the international movement of top thoroughbreds to this country is essential. So what has the government been able to do to facilitate that movement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to visiting my honourable friend's constituency on the 17th of March, where I will enjoy some of the racing, and it's important that we have high standards of health and welfare for the thoroughbreds. Moving forward, we are close as a government to publishing our target operating model proposals. That will take a proportionate risk-based and technically advanced approach to future phytosanitary controls, and we are still considering the approach specifically for live animals, particularly high-level equines, to understand how protecting biosecurity and minimising trade burdens can be carefully and safely managed.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indoor air pollution is an increasing problem and it poses real health risks. But there is no plan from the Tories to tackle it. But don't worry, Mr. Speaker, because help is on the way. That's why Labour will have a standalone Clean Air Act in our very first King's speech. But before we get there, can the Minister share what specific action she's taken to tackle indoor pollution? What discussions she's had with other government departments, and what other actions will she be bringing forward in the coming months? In other words, where is the plan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Clean Air Strategy in 2019 very specifically identified the issues on indoor air pollution, and that's why ongoing ventilation and advice on that is the standard approach. So this is true about things like scented candles, this is true about aspects like cleaning products, and while there are chemicals changing there, a lot of the report that the Chief Medical Officer put out fairly recently, a lot of that is already contained in the strategy that's underway. So it's important we tackle air pollution in all sorts of different ways, but the best advice about tackling indoor air quality is to open your windows 5 to 10 minutes a day to allow fresh air in, and that will significantly help reduce some of the impacts, and that's what's needed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank ministers for the continued support on coastal flooding, with £10 million allocated to upgrade flood defences in Fylde. But Fylde is a low-lying, largely flat coastal peninsula, meaning that even inland areas remain vulnerable to flooding. The Minister, Pow, has visited Fylde and I saw that for herself, but will the Minister join me for a further visit to the affected areas and commit to producing a long-term plan to relieve the issues?
I thank him for this, and I very much enjoyed my visit to Fylde. In fact, it was really education in terms of understanding just what benefits come from the flood spending we put in. Even in these very low-lying areas, you were getting the benefits of protecting the businesses. They felt safer. You got tourism. You got active travel on the great big embankment that had been strengthened. I would be delighted to come back, if my diary permits, to see the further work they're doing to get basically even more out of the funding that government is committed to from our £5.2 billion budget.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Ogmore mentioned the lack of government support for greenhouse producers, and we know that energy costs are having a great impact on farmers. But farmers are not included in the new business scheme that is coming into place at the end of March. Given we're about to have an urgent question on food shortages, will the government reconsider that decision?
Thursday.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the situation is that the UK government has already been helping households and businesses with the significant rises in energy costs. We've now starting to see a reduction in the wholesale gas prices, so this will start to feed through in terms of electricity prices. I think the government is more confident of that, but we will keep focused where particular intensive energy industry sectors are needing that support on an ongoing basis, but it is much more restricted, and she'll be aware of the reasons why.
Do it. Can I ask what steps my right honourable friend is taking to ensure the fishing industry is not squeezed out of their livelihood by such generally welcome but often conflicting factors such as offshore wind and marine protection areas, and that the industry is adequately represented in the decision-making process?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question and also pay tribute to the work that he does in this sector and the representations he's made. Obviously, I meet with the Scottish fishermen on a regular basis. I'm aware of the challenges that they are facing with spatial squeeze, but I'm also very much aware of the great work they do to keep the country fed with high-quality fish and supplying our food markets.
Okay, Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jarrow constituents face a rise in water bills from Northumbria Water. This company, owned by Cayman Islands registered Hong Kong CK Hutchinson Holdings, underspent its budget for repairs by 48%, yet they took profits of £2 billion a year, awarded millions to shareholders and pumped sewage into the North East waterways. So will the Secretary of State commit to fining water companies up to £250 million for dumping sewage?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm aware because Northumbrian Water is also the parent company of the water company that services my constituency. And I'm conscious that dividends were not paid out during COVID. However, the point stands that we need to get improved environmental performance from water companies. That's what we are doing. It's why we've also given Ofwat powers, which they've consulted on, to be able to link payments on dividends to things like environmental performance. And I hope Ofwat will come forward with their final proposal shortly.
If habitats can be restored to a quality in which reptiles, and in particular the smooth snake, can thrive, then they will be good for any wildlife. So that would be a good target, wouldn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I absolutely agree with the importance of securing habitat and the survival of reptiles, and indeed we will halt the decline in species abundance by 2030 and then increase abundance by at least 10% to exceed 22 levels by 2042. This is all set out in our environmental improvement plan, all 262 pages, but on the specific point, I very much look forward to an enlightened conversation with my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Child hunger has a significant impact on a child's ability to concentrate their behaviour and their attainment. Labour has set out that it will be providing breakfasts, and where Labour is in power is providing lunches for children in school. So what discussions is she having with the Education Secretary to ensure that children don't go hungry?
Mr. Speaker, I think this is similar to the question the Honourable Lady was raising earlier. So quite clearly, the Department for Education has responsibility for aspects to do with free school meals. We know that many millions of children benefit from that in this country. I'm very conscious that we want to try and make sure food is affordable. The food price inflation is very challenging right now. That's why we've acted to help with aspects of food production, but we continue to have to try and make sure that we get through this challenging time. That's why there are elements of support through things like the Household Support Fund, as well as other opportunities for people to make sure that no child needs to go hungry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was a pleasure to welcome my honourable friend for Taunton Deane to Manor Farm in Cheersley last month to see how farmer Rose Dale, the River Tame Conservation Trust and Freshwater Habitats Trust have created new floodplain freshwater wetland habitats. Will she congratulate everyone involved in this hugely successful project, and what steps are being taken for further such wetlands to be created?
I thank him for this. It was the most enjoyable and informative visit that we both took part on, and please pass on my thanks to the farmer Rose. And it just demonstrated the value of bringing water into the landscape, what value that is both for habitats and in many other places for flood control. And our nature-based solutions such as this are one of the key planks, not just of our flood policy, but also of our habitat restoration project.
Mr. Farrell-Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Farm Safety Foundation, or Yellow Wellies, as most of us know them, have just completed a recent campaign around trying to improve farmers' mental health. What actions can the Minister or the Secretary of State set out about what they're doing working cross-government and at a devolved level around developing mental health support schemes for farmers, because their mental health following the survey is plummeting, and we really do need a UK-wide strategy to offer more support.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for drawing attention to the campaign. Last week, the Yellow Wellies campaign had an action week. I hope he saw my contribution to that. It's very, very important that we recognise that mental health in rural communities is a challenge. If you're working alone for many hours, that can lead to dark thoughts, and we continue to work with charities in the sector to try and address the challenges that those people are facing and to give them the support they deserve.
Christopher Chope.
Mr. Speaker, why is the deposit return scheme in England not going to include glass bottles, unlike the situation in Scotland where glass bottles are included?
As he rightly points out, two different schemes are proposed. We've consulted very widely on this with industry in particular, and that's why we've taken the decision not to include glass bottles. Glass bottles will remain in the consistent collection from the doorstep, and this is widely from our consultations and the stakeholder engagement we've done considered to be the best way of increasing the amount of glass that we recycle.
Simon Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's 25-year environment plan aims to deliver cleaner water for our communities. Yet recent statistics show that the River Calder and Aire, which runs through Wakefield District, are the second and third most polluted waterways in England. And the Office for Environmental Protection, the government's own regulator, has said that progress has fallen far short. After 13 years in power, what steps is the Minister taking to clean up the waterways for the people of Wakefield?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're picking up after the inaction of the previous Labour government, and that takes time, and that's why we will continue to do it. So what I will say to the honourable gentleman is it's really important that we work on a catchment-based approach. That is the approach that is being taken. It's important that we do focus in on those rivers. It's why I'm asking Natural England to make progress with their SSI assessments around the country, particularly thinking of rivers. And I think it's important that we continue to make sure that we work together, the people who have the rights and responsibilities of owning that waterways, to make sure that we work together at a local level to make sure that his river is cleaner than ever before.
Patrick Reading.
Mr. Speaker, is the ploughing under of perfectly good crops because there's not enough labour to harvest them efficiently, is that a success of Brexit?
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman will be aware we've increased the number of visas available through the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme by another 15,000. There are 10,000 extra available visas should the industry require them. We're supplying the industry with the labour that it requires, and the scheme seems to be working very well at this moment in time.
Alan Dorrant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. Mr. Speaker, polling commissioned by the Dogs Trust found almost a quarter of dog owners' biggest worry was the rising cost of dog food, causing deep concern and issues of abandonment. My colleague from Glasgow East raised the campaign to remove VAT from pet food at the last DEFRA session. What discussion has the Minister had with the Treasury, and whether measures will be introduced to reduce or remove VAT from dog food in the coming budget?
So, Mr. Speaker, of course, pets are very precious to people and are often become the #1 priority behind children. But I think it's important to recognise that we need to try and make sure that people are generous in what they do. That I make a plea to the dog food and cat food manufacturers to help their customers at this challenging time. I know that there is a budget coming soon, but I'm not intending, I don't want to manage expectations. I'm not expecting changes to VAT rates more generally for specific products. But let's do what we can to make sure our pets get fed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With the Secretary of State's view that the financial sector must invest in projects to prevent biodiversity loss, what steps are the government taking to incentivise businesses to play their part?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We are working across government, including with Treasury, to identify opportunities for green finance, because we absolutely recognise in this country, but also all around the world, nature-based solutions and reducing the harm that's caused by public subsidies is an absolute priority, as set out in COP15 by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State in Montreal.
Yes. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'm so used to jumping up and then sitting down without realising. Can I ask a question? Northern Ireland fishermen have only received £14 million out of the additional £20 million quota they were due to receive. In addition to this, the Northern Ireland Protocol poses a potentially catastrophic threat to the fishing industry. So what discussions has the Minister had with the Northern Ireland Assembly and the POs in relation to the future of fish stocks in and around Northern Ireland and the Irish seas? Thank you.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. Of course, we have regular meetings with the devolved administrations. We also meet with CFAST on a regular basis to discuss the level of fish stocks within the sea. We want to give out those quotas in a fair and equitable way that supports the whole of the United Kingdom and all four of those administrations, and we'll continue to have those conversations and discussions.
Cunningham. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm really sorry to hear that ministers aren't prepared to travel to Teeside to face local people concerned about these ongoing sea life deaths. They say they want to find out the cause, so will they invest in further testing now rather than stick their heads in the sand?
Mr Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman knows and will have read the scientific report that says quite specifically that further investigation is highly likely to be futile, that we're quite unlikely to find that pathogen. Now, I can say to him quite directly, if we were to take the Honourable Gentleman and to analyse him for all the infections he has within him, we would find a lot of viruses that may actually not be relevant to his health or his condition, and that's the challenge. We have to find the pathogen at the moment that it is impacting on those crabs, and that moment has passed.
Mr Speaker,
my medical records were private.
Mr Speaker, are you aware that Shannon and Sherman are going on a world tour shortly? Can I ask the Secretary of State, would she agree with me that many of us think that the tyres on our vehicles are made of rubber? And research that I've recently come across shows that's not true. There is rubber, but there are 72 chemicals that many of them link to cancer. And that waste goes on our roads, flows into the gutter, into our streams, into our rivers and our seas. What are we going to do about this ghastly poison?
Mr Speaker, it matters about, and this is why we have increasingly higher environmental standards, considering different chemicals that get used in products every day. It's why we've got some challenges about the recycling of certain products like sofas and chairs. So, these are ongoing issues. I'm not aware of the science that he has commissioned, but what I am aware of is how the government has stepped up and supported people like Michelin to have the circular economy, to make sure that they were kept their factory here, so that we had, in effect, retread that could be remanufactured. And it's that sort of approach, making sure that we really promote the circular economy, is how we can help try and tackle some of the particular issues that arise from plastics.
That completes the questions. Those who wish to leave, please do so. Right, the urgent question, Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs if she will make a statement on UK food shortages.
Mr Speaker, the United Kingdom has a highly resilient food supply chain, as demonstrated throughout the COVID-19 response, and is well equipped to deal with situations with the potential to cause disruption. Now, we've seen in the last few days, Asda, Morrisons, Aldi and Tesco apply item limits to a small number of fruit and vegetables in response to issues for supply from Spain and North Africa. And these have been predominantly caused by seasonal weather hampering production and harvest during December and January. Now, the nature of horticulture and the effect of short-term events as weather on production can create some volatility, and any growing forecast is subject to short-term alterations. And we know that Ireland and other parts of Europe are facing very similar supply issues. Now, industry has the capability, levers and expertise to respond to disruption, and where necessary, my department will further support and enable that. I wish to reiterate, UK food security does remain resilient, and we continue to expect industry to be able to mitigate supply problems through alternative sourcing options. Now, in 2021, we imported over £1.5 billion worth of fruits and vegetables from Spain and £340 million worth from Morocco. We consistently import over 30,000 tonnes of fresh tomatoes every month of the year. And through the winter months, the majority of imports are from Morocco and Spain. But in the summer months, as more production comes online, we also import from the Netherlands. And in 2021, our home production accounted for around 17% of tomatoes. And we are working closely with industry bodies across the horticulture sectors to better understand the impacts, and there have already been meetings with retailers by officials, and there will be further meetings to understand their plans to mitigate current pressures. Minister Spencer will be convening a roundtable of retailers to explore with them their contractual models, their plans to return to normal supplies, and contingencies for dealing with these supply chain problems. Now, we know that farmers and growers around the world have been facing significant pressures caused by the invasion of Ukraine and the historic outbreak of avian influenza in Europe. And we also recognise the impact of rising food prices, a lot of it due as a result of global shocks, including the spike in oil and gas prices, and indeed exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. And that's why the government has taken steps to support energy costs. It cut tariffs to reduce feed costs. It improved avian influenza compensation schemes and has taken a range of measures on fertilisers. And indeed, UK growers were able to access the energy bill relief scheme. DEFRA will continue to keep the market under review through the UK Agricultural Market Monitoring Group and other engagement forums.
Jim McMahon, Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, and can I thank you, Mr Speaker, for granting this urgent question. You would have seen the coverage all over the front pages of the paper, all over the TV, because there is genuine public concern about the availability of food. And as the Secretary responsible for our food security, and let's bear in mind that food security is national security, this is absolutely mission critical. And frankly, I found that response to be completely detached from the reality that's being faced on the ground, whether that's through our supermarkets or our farmers. And this idea that somehow it's all external forces. Of course, we understand the impact of COVID and the spike coming out of COVID. We understand the impact of Brexit. We understand the impact of Ukraine, and we understand the impact of energy prices. We understand all of that. And so the question then is, well, what's in the control of the government? What levers does the government have to make this better today? They didn't have to make changes to direct payments that undercuts farmers. They didn't have to agree to international trade deals that really undersells farmers in the UK. They could have made sure that farmers and food producers had access to the energy-intensive support scheme, but decided not to. They could have made sure that the quotas on labour were sufficient to make sure that food wasn't rotting in the fields. Exactly. All these levers that the government have were there. When I met farmers in Lancashire who were the victims of avian flu, really struggling with how they can restart and recover and rebuild their businesses, they told me there's not a single scheme in DEFRA to help them restart. We've had 1 billion fewer eggs like this year than before the pandemic on our shelves. We literally had Pancake Day this week and you couldn't buy eggs to make your pancakes. This is the result of indifference and dithering from government. And in the end, if the government don't understand that food security is national security and we need to end sticking plaster politics and have a long-term plan, frankly, there is no hope for the nation.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr Speaker, I've set out, I think, pretty clearly what is going on right now. The Secretary of State, we have been on this transition, on the agricultural plan. It sounds to me like he's now abandoning that. That's in conflict with what the Leader of the Opposition said the other day. So that's interesting. A Labour split already within 48 hours. So in terms of that, I'm slightly surprised that the gentleman is clearly trying to play politics with a very serious situation. So in terms of, Mr Speaker, I think it's important to state about some of the support that has been given. We did make changes to the aviation influenza compensation scheme. We're very conscious. I think that the number of hens went down by about 4 million last year. There's still about 36 to 38 million hens, laying hens in this country. And it's important that we continue to have that discussion. The retailers have had pretty much a reliable supply chain, but we know this particular issue that's happened in southern Spain and Morocco is unusual, and that's why we need to have a resilient farming industry. It's why we need to have a resilient supply chain. In terms of asbestos greenhouses, we're seeing the industry evolve. But I'm not aware that any greenhouse owner actually gets any basic payment scheme. It's a different way of doing that. In terms of the energy bill support has been open to various parts of the sector and continues to be so. I'm conscious that won't be necessarily the case from April or the significant reduction. But I think the Honourable Gentleman needs to be careful about making sure that we continue to have confidence in the food supply chain, to have confidence, and this is that we have confidence in the food supply chain. It is important that people are careful. This is why the supermarkets have decided to try and stop a lot of the buying and to make sure everybody still has access to enough of the different fruit and vegetables that we have there. I'm led to believe by my officials, after discussion with industry and retailers, we anticipate this situation will last about another 2 to 4 weeks. It's important that we try and make sure that we get alternative sourcing options, and that's why the department has already been in discussion with the retailers. It's why there'll be further discussions led by ministers as well, so that we can try and get over this and try and avoid similar situations in the future. Even if we cannot control the weather, it is important that we try and make sure the supply continues to not be frustrated in quite the way it has been due to these unusual weather incidents.
Sir Desmond Sway.
If only I had been told before I voted for Brexit that it was going to cause frosts in Morocco, I could have made a different decision, couldn't I?
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the joys of being the Secretary of State for DEFRA is that you have both the environment and agriculture in the same portfolio. And that leads us to take a very sensible, careful, long-term approach about considering the factors that can both help our farming sector and can also help the environment. That's why we've designed the Environmental Land Management Scheme. It's why we're on this careful journey as we move people from a very rigid element of what was BPS under the Common Agricultural Policy, where in this country, about more than half the subsidy went to just 10% of the farmers. And that's the point. And the Honourable Gentleman, I think, wanted to go back into the European Union. That was the decision, was being made by all the countries. So the Honourable Gentleman clearly doesn't know his history or actually know anything about CAP. What he should be doing, unlike the Shadow Secretary of State, who now seems to be undermining the Environmental Land Management Scheme, they should be recognising that some of the initiatives that we've been funding, a number of different grants, the way we've tackled things like tariffs on imports, those are the sorts of approaches where we can help our farming industry. But importantly, we now need to, the retailers are working to get alternative sourcing so that those restrictions on consumer consumption will not be in place very soon.
SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State's response shows that she and her government refuse to take any responsibility for their own shortcomings. Farmers across the UK have been warning of the risk of food shortages for some time as a result of rising costs and Brexit trade barriers. So why did this government not heed those warnings? Who would have thought in 2023 the UK would be facing food shortages, which, despite what we're being told, is uniquely affecting the UK, the only European country with empty supermarket shelves. The reality is that food shortages are due to low food production, which is in serious decline under this government's watch. In addition, the supermarket sector has been, and I quote, hurt horribly by Brexit, according to the Chief Executive of Sainsbury's. The chair of Save British Food has accused the government of, and I quote, absolute negligence and not caring about food production and shattering food security. Is the Secretary of State, in all honesty, not embarrassed and ashamed that under her and her government's watch, the UK is poorer, has less food, a declining agricultural sector and higher food costs because of Brexit failure and the empty rhetoric of taking back control.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't recognise a lot of what the Honourable Lady says in terms of food production. That might be true in Scotland, but that's a devolved element, so she might want to go and look. But the Honourable Lady seems to not take any ownership of what the SNP government is doing in Scotland on their farming policies. So what I will say, as we set out in the government's food strategy last year and set out in our manifesto, we want to maintain, if not, and as I said to the NFU yesterday, if not even increase the amount of domestic food security that we have. But there's a number of products, the Honourable Lady will know, that we cannot grow in this country, and we also have a season. There's an element here. And so in terms of, I think one of the main differences that we're seeing with some European countries or some European supermarkets in here is that our supermarkets often have a fixed price contract, and whereas in other countries there can often be a trend to have a variable price contract. I think that's one of the things that my right honourable friend will be going into detail with the supermarkets to recognise that. But, as I say, there has been unusual weather in Morocco and South Spain, which has led to a temporary restriction. Well, the Honourable Lady continues to chunter from a sedentary position. As I say, this is for her and her government in Scotland to decide what they are doing about food production. This Conservative government backs our farmers. That's the main purpose of farmers. We want them to grow food, we want them to make a good living out of it, and we will continue to support them with the £2.4 billion a year. That is a combination currently of basic payments, but also the initiatives in order to make sure that we have a resilient, sustainable and profitable food industry for many generations to come.
Len Saxman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wonder if my right honourable friend agrees with me that actually the supermarkets are still importing far too many produce for us, and that actually we should be eating more seasonally and supporting our own British farmers. And if we were actually to move to a seasonal line of eating, many of these problems would be avoided, and that there are great food products available from local farmers at this time. And can I take this opportunity to thank the DEFRA ministers for joining me yesterday at the Taste of Exmoor event, where we met some of those farmers vital to our food supply.
Well, as ever, my honourable friend is a great champion for her constituents, and by bringing the Taste of Exmoor to Parliament, I don't know if you had the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid I did not, because I was returning from the NFU conference. But it's important to make sure that we cherish the specialisms that we have in this country. A lot of people would be eating turnips right now rather than thinking necessarily about aspects of lettuce and tomatoes and similar. But I'm conscious that consumers want a year-round choice, and that is what our supermarkets and food producers and growers around the world try to satisfy.
Clive.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, I always knew the Conservatives were a bunch of bean counters, but this is really off the scale. The fact that our supermarkets have had to impose a form of food rationing, whilst the chief bean counter comes to the dispatch box and says, crisis, what crisis? Now, what does she agree with the President of the NFU, Minette Batters, who's accused the government of a dereliction of duty for failing to ensure we have a fit-for-purpose post-Brexit set of border checks on agricultural imports? That wasn't what we were promised before the Brexit vote.
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman should withdraw the phrases that he used, because I didn't use those words at the dispatch box. But what I will say to the Honourable Gentleman is that I've recognised, and we do recognise, this particular issue right now. That's why the Department is already in discussion with retailers. It's why the Minister will be meeting the retailers. But I am very conscious this particular incident is driven aspects of the supply chain. The primary source for goods right now is from an area that was affected by very unusual weather before and after Christmas. To have snow, I think, and the amount of heat that was there and the amount of other adverse weather is pretty unusual. And that's something that the supply chain has to try and manage. Right now, the supermarkets have chosen a particular way. That's why we will continue to meet them, and I'm hoping that this will be a temporary issue. This volatility is unwelcome, but I'm conscious that our supply chain is resilient and that we will continue to invest in our farmers for generations to come.
Greg Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has been absolutely right in pointing to the factors she has in answer to this urgent question. Can I push her a little bit further on the question of energy and urge her to work more closely with a right honourable friend for Welland Hatfield in seeing if we can reclassify what is energy-intensive industry within the support schemes we've got, because agriculture and horticulture is incredibly energy-intensive, yet hasn't had the same support as some manufacturing sectors, which could revolutionise British farming and keep businesses afloat.
Well, I'm conscious of what my honourable friend says, and I think this, in particular, the industrial glasshouse is an emerging industry, not a long-established one. I think my right honourable friend will always be looking to consider who should be eligible. We will always continue to make the case on why we think this is an important sector, but I'm very conscious that there is a scaling back, a significant scaling back, recognising that other issues like the wholesale price of gas has fallen since that, and that we expect to see a reduction in energy prices coming through.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that these food shortages will impact on school meals. Isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, that we should be looking to give free school meals to far more children in England, the same as Scotland and Wales already does?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, free school meals is a policy for the Department for Education. I'm very conscious that due to the Barnett formula, that the administrations of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales get a lot more funding per head. I don't anticipate that will change, but of course they then have the freedom to do policies which are relevant to their local demographics. I'm conscious that we want to try to see more people to be in good profitable work so that people don't need to rely on free school meals, and that's the intention of the government going forward.
Andrew Bridger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the retailer has actually taken the right strategy to avoid panic buying? As we know from a couple of years ago, any perceived or real shortage does lead to panic buying. We recall about the situation with toilet rolls a couple of years ago. And because these products are fruit and vegetables, they're perishable and short shelf life, it's not only panic buying would not only exacerbate the shortage, but would also lead to a lot of food wastage as well.
Well, my honourable friend is very knowledgeable of this area, and I'm conscious of consumers need to be able to buy the products they want to be able to buy, and that's why we rely. The supermarkets normally have a very resilient supply chain. We have a particular issue right now, which I believe they are trying to fix. Some of them are taking this particular approach to make sure that every customer can still access those products. But I think it's important to reflect that sometimes when words are said, we saw this before Christmas. A particular industry person talked about that there was going to be a shortage of free-range turkeys. In the end, consumers heard, they moved their things, and then we ended up with a glut and the prices fell. So people do need to be careful when we're talking about the resilience and food supply chain, that we have that confidence. I know this is temporary, I believe it to be temporary, and I'm confident it will be fixed within the next 2 to 4 weeks.
Karen McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will have heard the leader of the Labour Party announce at the NFU conference this week that he wants 50% of all public procurement of food to be locally and sustainably sourced, which is something they have done in France for a long time. DEFRA had a consultation on public sector food procurement that closed on the 4th of September, so nearly 6 months ago. I've not heard any ministers mention it since. Is that policy, is that consultation still live? When are we going to get a response? Because that is actually going to be hugely influential in terms of supporting food sovereignty in this country.
So, Steve.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we set out elements in our food strategy. I think there were aspects in our manifesto commitment about our commitment to having British food. In terms of, it's a very welcome compliment that the Leader of the Opposition takes a policy of the Conservative government. But we want to continue to try, and we will act on the response of the consultation. But I know that the Honourable Lady will be aware that these elements need to be considered carefully and across government in how we take certain policies forward. And indeed, we need to also be mindful of aspects of things like WTO rules, but I will continue to be a champion for British produce. I will continue to be a champion for local procurement, who can already make those choices now if they wish to do so, and they don't need government clearance in order to do so.
Christopher Cho.
Mr Speaker, does my right honourable friend accept the figure that there are 170,000 tonnes of fresh produce supply wasted every year in this country? And does she think that as a result of this current crisis, it will actually encourage consumers to value more highly their fruit and veg and the 5 a day?
Well, it's very important that consumers have that choice, but we're also very conscious and why we are committed to trying to reduce the amount of food waste that happens. And not only that, it's obviously a shame for any food to be wasted. Clearly, we also are concerned about the amount of emissions, the carbon emissions that arise from food waste, a significant factor, pathway of which we are trying to reduce in terms of our response into achieving net zero.
Emma Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, despite claims that this is a Europe-wide problem, there are no reported shortages of food in France, Germany and other European net food importers. Isn't it the case that this is a problem created by inward-looking Little England and by this British government?
Here, here.
No, it's not.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's 2023 and there are crops rotting in the fields because there's not enough people to pick them. There are kids going hungry in all our communities, and now we have rationing in our supermarkets. That is not because people are stockpiling and panic buying salad, although you can't keep salad that long, although the lettuce lasts longer than the last Prime Minister. I do want the Secretary of State to have some more grip, some more control and some more leadership on this. I think the responses so far have been complacent. So unless she wants to go down as the Secretary of State for sewage, food shortages and rural poverty, what is her plan to properly address the food shortages that we are facing here? Because this is a serious issue for families up and down the country.
It is a serious issue, but I'm afraid that question just shows the lack of knowledge and the bandwagon jumping of the honourable member. To try and suggest that there's nobody out in the fields picking vegetables right now, they're not available right now in our fields. We have a supply chain that brings that food in around from the world. I'd love to hear about which farms in his constituency are short right now of people being able to pick tomatoes or lettuces, because I have to say it's probably about as rare as... I was about to say, I'm just about as rare as how successful he would like us to be. Well, what's the best way of doing it? I had a great one, Mr. Speaker. I don't know, gold at the end of the rainbow. Perhaps he believes in fairy tales. He certainly doesn't know how the food supply system works. He jumps on a bandwagon and he must be embarrassed, and I hope that his constituents reflect the fact that he knows nothing about how their daily lives are affected by this.
Larry Sherman.
Shocking! Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I know the Secretary of State to be a decent, good-hearted woman, but today I would say to her that this is a national emergency. Children and families, lower-income children and families in my constituency are struggling to afford basic foods, eggs, milk, all the basics that a family has to have. There is a national emergency, not just the shortages, the high cost of basics. Will she take action?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UQ is about food shortages, and I think I've set out pretty clearly to the House what has happened in the supply chain, what the department is doing about it, what the sectors are doing about it, and my expectation that this will be a 2 to 4 week element. Now, he talks more broadly about food prices. This country has a long time enjoyed the competitiveness provided by the supermarkets, but I'm conscious that has also had impacts on some of the contracts that have been signed by farmers, and a lot of them being fixed prices. But it's important that we continue to support our domestic food production, which this government clearly does. It's important that we will continue to try and support people with the cost of living, which this government is absolutely doing. And it's important, as the Prime Minister set out in our top priorities, to be halving inflation. It's those factors that we're taking on short, immediate approaches, as well as longer-term approaches like getting energy security. Those are the ways to get a sustainable element of where we get inflation, but also acting on the food plan, food strategy we set out last year, and that we will continue to make sure that farmers produce food in this country and that there's no reason for why people don't have food on their dinner plate every night.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, declining self-sufficiency over the past 30 years has left the UK increasingly exposed to shocks to global supply chains. Brexit trade barriers hinder attempts at sourcing alternative supplies, and the government's own food security report identified that climate change is likely to have a significant impact on production in the countries from which we import a lot of our fruit and veg at present. So what is the government going to do to support and incentivise greater domestic production to avoid a repeat of these shortages in the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UK government's already set out its approach. We also have a very strong trade agreement with the European Union. I'm very conscious that some of this is connected to a particular shortage of supplies that come into most of our supermarkets in a part of Morocco and southern Spain. But I'm also aware that he represents a Welsh constituency. This is a devolved matter, and he might want to ask the Labour government in Wales what they are doing in order to support.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State was booed this week by farmers at the NFU conference for talking down to them and claiming that she knew better about the cause of food shortages. She's telling us today that this is an EU-wide problem, but we can see that there are not the same shortages EU-wide, including in other European net food importers. Does she think that adverse weather really only affects the sunny uplands of Brexit Britain? And does she not see that her absolute continued wedding to the failure of Brexit is one of the reasons why we are seeing less food, a poorer country overall, and higher food costs?
No, that's not the situation, Mr. Speaker. And it's not the situation. The Honourable Gentleman could have been in the chamber earlier if he wanted to ask a question. It's not the situation. What we have, particularly right now, is a particular issue that's affected a supply chain of certain products. And the supermarkets are acting, and it is happening in other European countries, not all, but as I've explained to the House on more than one occasion, sometimes the contracts are different, and that's why my right honourable friend is convening to meet with the retailers directly. We've already been doing that as a department, and we will continue to do so.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State keeps dismissing concerns of the farming industry about food shortages, yet supermarkets are restricting food to customers. Clearly, her department is out of touch with the real world. Does she agree the Prime Minister should call a COBRA meeting, because this is now a national emergency and out of the control of her department?
Seriously.
So, as I said to the NFU yesterday, farmers are here to feed the country. That's why we support them, and we'll continue to support them. We support them in a number of different ways. Now, we're going through a transition away from a financial support system, a direct payment system, the basic payment, to where more than half of the money was going to just 10% of the farmers, because it was based on the amount of land that people had. So that's part of the journey that we're underway. But there's still significant amounts of basic payment system going into there. It's why we still want to encourage, as our manifesto set out, and as I said to the NFU again yesterday, that we want to maintain at least the amount of domestic food production, if not even higher. And that's what we will continue to do, to try and support that and to make sure that our farmers are there for generations to come.
James Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her answers? And there's always trying to be constructive in those answers. Having heard examples of shoppers turned away from shops for trying to purchase vegetables for their family of 7, just told this story just yesterday, it is clear that steps must be taken to secure our produce. And can the Secretary of State outline the steps being taken to ensure that paperwork for importation at this time is a smooth system, allowing for new suppliers to be found and easily facilitated at this time of shortage and need. Thank you.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm conscious that we are still working on, he'll be aware of issues involving Northern Ireland Protocol, which lead in terms of exchanges between the UK. I think it's important to recognise that the suppliers are proactively working with supermarkets. That's what we're being told. We're being told there's an issue for about another potentially up to 4 weeks, and I'm very keen that the sector gets on and gets that alternative sourcing options. Meanwhile, we will continue to try and encourage and boost food production. That's always been set out in our food strategy and our manifesto commitment, and that's why I'm absolutely determined that we will try and help deliver.
That completes the urgent question. We now come to business questions, where I call the Shadow Leader of the House, Thangan Debona.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, to ask the Leader of the House if she will give us the forthcoming business.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The business for the week commencing the 27th of February will include, on Monday the 27th of February, second reading of the Lifelong Learning Higher Education Fee Limits Bill. 28th of February, Opposition Day, 13th allotted day, debate in the name of the official opposition subject to be announced. Wednesday the 1st of March, motion to approve an instruction related to the Social Housing Regulation Bill Lords, followed by remaining stages of the Social Housing Regulation Bill Lords. Thursday the 2nd of March, general debate on changes of name by registered sex offenders, followed by a general debate on Welsh affairs. The subjects for these debates were determined by the Backbench Business Committee. Friday the 3rd of March, private members' bills. The provisional business for the week commencing the 6th of March includes Committee of the Whole House and remaining stages of the Social Security Additional Payments